Hi there, my name's Rob, this is Andrew Balmer and this is Camilla Lewis, and we're three researchers from the Morgan Centre, or we're all affiliated with the Morgan Centre for Research into Everyday Lives, and we're going to talk about olfactory methods. We'll go through a brief introduction maybe so that we can understand where everybody's coming from, what perspectives you guys are coming from, because we're all slightly different as well. So would you like to go first?
I'm Camilla Lewis and I'm an anthropologist, sociologist based here in the Sociology department, and my research largely focuses on urban change, and I'm interested in different ways that sensory methods can be used to explore people's experiences of cities and their everyday lives.
Hi, I'm Andy Balmer. I'm a sociologist but scientist originally and retrained. So most of my work is about science and technology in one way or another, and is concerned with everyday life phenomena for the most part. Part of what I do is about secrecy and lying, and I won't be talking about that today. And the other part is about how science and technology are organised and how they figure as part of our everyday lives.
My name is Robert Meckin. I made a similar transition from bioscience into sociology, and I've concentrated a lot of my research so far on biotechnology and the organisation and alignment of biotechnology with other aspects and other areas and domains in society, as well as increasingly how publics might come to understand biotechnologies. Right, so thanks very much. So there's obviously quite a range of different disciplinary backgrounds and interests that people have. We're going to be drawing on our experience in three different projects. Do you want to say a little bit about each of yours? So, Water Industries at the top.
Yeah, we'll say more about each of them as we go along, but the project that I'm mostly going to talk about today is one that I did sort of 6 or 7 years ago, which was an ethnography of water industry spaces and water laboratories in a university context. So I spent lots of time sort of looking at pipes of various kinds.
And I'm going to be talking about some research I did last year at Smithfield Market, which is in central London, and it still remains the largest wholesale meat market in the UK, but it's undergoing a huge project of urban regeneration, which I was studying. So I was doing kind of an ethnographic project looking at how the atmosphere of this area of London is going to be changed dramatically as part of the regeneration process.
And the third project is Menthol in Practice, which is part of a project I'm research associate on with Andy. Andy's co-owner project, which is about how biotechnologies are understood by publics in society, and how they get interpreted. And so we took it as an opportunity to explore ethics and moralities as part of how smells can be configured in that way. It's going to be quite an informal session, so please feel free to chip in or ask questions at any point. And from now on, I have here a reference list for you, but we're not going to be talking about references and literature in detail. It's more from our experience throughout the rest of this session, so it's kind of a bit more practical in a way. And so with that in mind, we're going to run a bit of a data collection. So what I'd like you to do is have a smell or a taste or a sniff of these products. You're welcome to try them, put them on if you would like, in this case. Down. And when you're have a smell, think and speak to the person next to you. Say what you think this smell reminds you of, or what you associate it with. Okay. So does anybody have any standout smells that they would like to comment on that you've just spoken to your neighbour about?
You both really like the Tiger Balm.
You like it?
I've not really smelt it before. It's got different ingredients than the other menthol, so it's quite different, unfamiliar to me. But it's quite familiar to you two from your childhoods.
Yeah, basically, because I'm from Pakistan, this reminds me of my childhood. I've never come across it here in the UK. It's something we use back in that country. I remember as a child I used to have a toothache and we used to apply it on my jaw and it really worked. And yeah, it's the first time I've come across it. So it reminds me of my childhood.
Yeah. And who did you used to put it on yourself then, or did somebody in your family put it on?
No, not something like my dad usually used to.
Your dad used to? Yeah, okay.
So.
Does anybody else recognise that kind of idea? If anybody smelt some of the other? Yeah?
Yeah. The vapor rub, it kind of reminds me of home.
Okay.
And of being sick. but at the same time it's kind of like how can I describe it? Like a comforting, like a comforting smell. Yeah.
Okay.
I was ill, but someone was taking care of me.
Did you have anything to say?
Well, I just wanted to say that also my dad used to use the tiger thing, but it was way stronger, like the house would smell like that for 3 hours after he wrapped someone's arm or something. So, and I've always wondered what that was, but we always said it's the tiger thing. So.
Tigers in the house.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, some of what you've been describing has come out very strongly in the mental project that we've been doing. So people, as we'll talk about in a second, people sort of talk about families and their own histories, and there's a sense of place. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to?
We had this thing which was supposed to be mental, but it didn't smell mental at all. It smelled like cream with caramel.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it was more mental once you start reading.
Yeah, I think it might be. It might be something to do with the way it's incorporated and the flavours that come out.
Well, also one thing that I just realized is I never smelled, for example, things in comparison. So, for example, this mint and menthol, and they're different. Although typically mint is mint, or it's menthol. Of course there's slight differences, but you never care about making that differentiation because you're never trying to make it on purpose. The comparison. But now when you smell them, they're actually very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, as part of our project, one of the things that we had was peppermint oil and menthol crystals, so that you could smell the direct difference between them as well. So not only is their incorporation in different consumer products, but also their kind of more isolated smells and effects on the human body. Well, I suppose just that was a very brief run-in of what it might feel like to be a participant using some of the methods that we've been trialling with. So I'll just skip through these next few slides. So we've used, for the menthol project in particular, but also some of the others, we've used different methods for eliciting people. So use these kinds of methods in different contexts. So we've used observations where people have gone onto site and either just hung around in the laboratory or been into people's homes and so on. We've done home tours and interviews based on the objects, where we've taken these objects into people's homes and they've interacted with them and shown us around their homes, hence these photographs, or hence this photograph, to show where menthol is stored and how it figures as part of, and mint, and how they figure part of people's lives. And then, because this project was also partly about, this menthol project was partly about getting into public's understandings, we did a series of pop-up stalls where we were in a museum and a supermarket, and a garden centre and a shopping centre and other places to, as people pass by, we would encourage them to be part of this research project, and then sometimes we'd look to ask them if they would be interested in being part of the interview as well. So it was partly a recruitment drive, and as part of these pop-up stalls, this is a mock-up of what it looked like, or a photograph of what it looked like. So we had all the products, and we are asking people, they'd have a conversation with us in a similar way that you've done as they pass by, and then we would ask them to fill out multiple these postcards that was one way that we were collecting data, which we were then able to analyse. So we had different coloured postcards for different things. So yellow was about people's memories and associations, and green and red were about positive and negative aspects that they felt, particularly in relation to biotechnology, and white was any questions and any other ideas that they had that they wanted to add. And we were also working with an artist, and I put this up because it's quite useful to show some of the, I think she's an illustrator, and she's kind of captured, not so much, it wasn't incorporated into our data analysis, but it really conjures how it is to do this kind of research and what it kind of looks like. So this was in a museum, there's the T-Rex skeleton hanging over us and people passing by and filling out their postcards. And then this was a focus group where we had people sitting around in a climbing centre and interacting and talking about their experiences with menthol. And there's these kind of, Lynn, who did the illustration, was able to pull out different things. So the extreme tingle is this product here, a bit of packaging, but also captured some of the things that people were saying as well. Would you like to?
Yep. So we're going to put you into the role of research participants again now and have a quick activity to think about some other ways that you can elicit talk about the senses. So I'd now like you to turn to your partner and to first of all have a discussion. We're just going to take a couple of minutes over this about a particular place that you associate with a strong sense of smell. It could be any place, but it's somewhere that you, when you think about it, a particular smell comes to mind. And then the second part of the activity, the other person, I'd like you to tell your neighbour about what home smells like. So this could be the home that you live in now, or it could be a particular home that you've lived in the past. What's the smell that you associate when you think about home or going home? So we'll just take a couple of minutes to do that if you just want to turn to your partner, and we'll come back and have a discussion about what you've been talking about. So first of all, place, then second about home. Does anybody want to share what they were talking about in terms of a place that has a particularly strong reminder of a smell? Yeah.
Just down there, the curry mine.
Yeah.
You can smell the curries.
Yeah. And when you were talking about that memory, did it evoke further discussions about particular incidents where you've been there or people that you've been with?
Not really.
No? Anyone else, particularly a place with a strong smell, yeah?
Yeah, for me it's like also nearby Curry Mine, but I usually go to work with this street called Hill Place, which is like halfway between Curry Mine and the brewery.
Uh-huh.
I think it's fascinating because then you can always know where the wind comes from.
Yeah.
If it comes from the west, you have extremely strong smell of rotten yeast.
Yeah, yeah.
If it comes from the Curry Mine, you have the smell of roasted lamb and water pipe.
Yeah.
And then if it comes from Fallowfield, you have the smell of marijuana and so
Do you ever get a combination of all three on it? Okay, anyone want to tell us about what they were talking about in relation to home? Are there any strong evocative memories about smells in relation to home?
We talked about manure. And
not what I was expecting.
No. Even though I was going to, we were saying that place and home crossed over a lot.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, because I live near Blackpool, the smells there are very evocative. And we both said, well, I was saying about donkeys and the seaside, and you said you're North Italy, horses.
Yeah.
So ours was manure. That was the crossover.
Great. Anyone else anything about home? Did anybody find it difficult to think of a smell in relation to home?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not enough to describe only using the smell, because always there's some kind of emotions, kind of things involved.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so that's a really important point, and one which will probably be discussed throughout the next examples, about how sometimes we might ask people questions about particular sensory experiences that they might find harder to describe. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of these methods. And perhaps sometimes where we don't have very strong recollections, that also might tell us things about other senses that perhaps take a more important role. So this example that you've just been running through is to illustrate the point about place and space, and the way that we're going to theme the way that we're going to organise what we're going to discuss next is using themes. So I'm going to tell you a bit about, and we're going to pick out examples from our research using these themes and kind of pass between ourselves.
Can you clarify the difference between space and place in your research?
So why don't we go on to the examples, and then you might see a bit more about the way that we're talking about the differences or not between place and space. So the research that I've been doing, as I quickly explained at the beginning, is about an area of London called Smithfield, which has this wholesale meat market that you can see at the top. And I was interested in talking to people about the ways in which this area of the city is changing under a huge project of regeneration which is taking place around the market. And in particular, we were interested in what makes the atmosphere of this area. So I'm going to give you an example of a discussion that I had with somebody who was working in the market, in which I asked them whether or not the market had a particular atmosphere. And you can see their response here. They said, well, I guess it does. It's not like anything else really. And you get the smell of meat, which is an unusual raw meat, which has an interesting kind of aroma. And I showed you this example because I think that it illustrates the ways in which senses are described in relation to particular places. So for example, like your discussion of the smells which you might get at a particular place in Manchester as you're walking to work, this is a similar example in London, in this area where there's a very unusual smell within the city, and that's of raw meat, and how this is described in relation to the atmosphere by the particular market worker. So I think sometimes these quite unusual smells, so the smell of yeast again or curry, can be markers of particular places and the ways in which people think about places within an urban environment. Do you want to come on to your example?
Yes, thank you. Cheers. So these are 4 photographs from the menthol project, and you can see that mint and menthol figures in quite different small spaces in and around people's lives and bodies. So this is some chewing gum next to coffee in the car, so quite often mint is alongside other strong smells, and people use it partly to mask those or to refresh their breath and so on, but also because it's a chewing gum to help concentrate during driving or to stave off hunger and those sorts of things so that they would perhaps eat more healthily. So this is that's sort of one set of practices. Then we have people having handheld or quite small formulations of mint and menthol. So this is an Olbus oil inhalant. People have in amongst a handbag, perhaps with their tissues for when they've got a cold and they're not feeling so well. This person actually had lots and lots of these inhalants, and she immediately found another one in this small pocket just here as well. So it was quite an important part for her in terms of how she managed her illness. And then here we've got the first aid box, which tended to be where some menthol products, particularly Vicks, is kept, and where people would sort of store it out of reach of their children. This family, this is Jen, pseudonym, pretending to, or demonstrating how they applied Vicks Vapor Rub to her son when he was ill. And it was quite fun, and it was tactile, and it was making sure it went into the right place, but it was also something that was done at the correct time of day, so it was tending to be done in the evening. But in terms of place as well, their daughter they caught when she was about 2 or 3 years old eating Vicks Vapor Rub, and that had been very concerning for them, and they'd phoned the NHS and to check that it was going to be okay and that it was going to be safe. So it's quite bound up in the way that people do their practices, where these products and smells are and where they should be, and where they should be in the house and on the body. So for example, a lot of people have talked about using shower gels in particular ways with menthol, but being careful around certain areas of the body, for example, that where smell, that particular sensation may or may not be what you're looking for. And then, you're right, fine.
From my own case, regarding space and place, I spent a lot of time going to places that I wouldn't now want to return to, like sewerage works. This is a street, but the water industry has a range of places that it's involved with, since water's carried across our landscapes, but it also has to be treated in particular ways to be put back into the water system or to be sort of separated out. And some of those facts of how water gets dirty and has to be cleaned and returned to the world mean that the water industry is set up around making things containing things away from the world, and sort of hiding things from us a lot of the time. You know, think about how pipes have become underground really rather than above ground. And you often find that sewerage treatment facilities, where the water's dirty and being treated after use, are separated away from residential areas. So the water industry is an excellent example of the way in which a whole bunch of practices in social organisation are set up for the management of smell, to keep certain smells away from us, or to bring some smells towards us. Water has a faint smell, not very strong, but in another utility industry, gas is given a smell, right, to make it visible to us in a way that it wouldn't be otherwise, because of safety, hazards and health and so forth. So a lot of practices that we think of as being related to one thing or another actually have quite a strong dimension of smell within them, around containing them, moving them around, holding them in place. But smells, particularly bad smells, can be quite sticky, and they can cling to our clothing, or they can get stuck in our nose. It was really hard, after having been in the sewerage treatment plant all day, to not just smell that place all the time afterwards. And in the labs now, there's like yeast laboratories, and that has a really distinct smell, or E. coli. So because things get sticky, because smell gets sticky, people have routines for managing that process of keeping smell off their clothes, or of getting rid of it afterwards. So there are practices for containing, removing, putting on smell, all the way up from our everyday routines to do with clothes and our bodies, to massive infrastructures and whole industries. And by looking at these kinds of things, I would say you don't need to be studying smell necessarily to find this kind of stuff interesting. I think what smell can tell us in those things is something about other phenomena often, and it can speak to our understanding of the senses more broadly, but also to the range of practices in which it's configured.
Okay, so the second theme, which we're going to give you some examples from our research, is on time and memory, and it very much relates to the space and place. So going back to my research in London, I was interested in how the atmosphere of place was changing over time. And in all the discussions that I was having with people who were using this area around the market, the theme of history kept coming up time and again. Everybody told me that this was an area that was unique compared to other places in the city because it had a very strong sense of history. But what was really interesting in all the discussions that I had about this sense of history was how amazingly vague and ambiguous people were. They kept talking about kind of historical feeling, but didn't seem to have much sense of exactly what made up this history. But from these two examples, I wanted to illustrate the fact that this historical, so-called historical feel was very much associated with the sensory experiences. And this often elicited quite a strong emotional response, which was very much connected to people's biographies and their experiences around this site. So, for example, I spoke to a woman who was a local resident who described that as a vegetarian, the smell of meat as she passed the market was particularly distinctive. She described it as a cold smell. So there's a really interesting blend here between the senses, between how a smell could be associated with a kind of cold feeling. She said it was something that she associated with death when she walked through the area, this smell. And it wasn't something that was particularly nice. She said that she felt more connected to kind of more positive smells for her, such as the smell of warm beer coming out of a pub. Again, this kind of blending of warmth and smell. And she also described the buildings as having a particular feeling, the churches which surrounded the area. So that gives you some indication about the way in which people were talking about sensory experiences in relation to history, based on her kind of memories of spending time in this area. The second one's quite different. This comes from somebody who didn't live in this area of London, but who had spent many days, had many experiences coming to work in Smithfield. And his experience was quite different. He said that he could remember the things like a small power station which has a brick tower, and the smell of gas from this. He said it was very strange to see in central London. And then also interesting, sometimes when he was working, the office window would come open, and he could smell the gas drift through, or the hoot of a siren. So again, blending of senses there between what you can smell and you can hear. And then also something that he kind of said in a kind of quite a humorous way, that at 4 o'clock he'd be working on a Friday and he could smell barbecued prawns coming from a kind of high-end restaurant that was round the corner. And this really reminded him of the very different uses of this area. So he might never actually see people dining in this restaurant, but the smell would be a very strong signifier of the many different kind of uses of space around the market. So those two show you how kind of very different personal experiences, how the senses very much relate to these different experiences.
I think we might actually have to speed up a little bit, because we might run short on time fractionally. But I've pulled out a couple of quotes that I thought gave you different ideas about how people recount things in their past, given this the elicitation using smells. So Karina was talking about how she had a Vicks rubbed on her, and it really reminded her of being very small and having a big nose and a tiny little face, and that she was kind of looked after when she was a child, and that's why she really likes smelling menthol. It's this sense of comfort, and so I think one of the important things is the way that that smell here is tied up in affect and emotion, and how people remember it and then recount it as part of the research. Nicholas is talking here about his dad, and his dad used to eat fishermen's friends, which you may or may not know, but they were strong sweets. And he kind of talks about how his dad would keep them in the garage during the winter and eat them in that cold environment, and he'd give himself a blast with the menthol. And I think one of the things here is that it gives quite a sense of the relationship, and how his dad was kind of in the garage and doing using tools and in the woodwork and doing whatever. But at the same time, his father was also extremely ill at this point. So there's a kind of what's the word?
Mournfulness.
Pardon? Mournfulness? Yes, I suppose, yes. To this account, which I think, or you can read it through when you know that piece of information. So again, it's the quality of the way that people narrate their relationships seems to come out in a slightly different way when you use this kind of elicitation. And so we've got a couple of examples of what this idea of how the senses can be used to move from quite an intimate personal account to a more general or more political ideas.
Try and be quick. So, the same site, water gets dirty, has to be cleaned. The water industry is set up around that dichotomy of clean and dirty, and smell often plays a very powerful role in how we negotiate that idea of what constitutes clean and what constitutes dirt. And in that regard, I'd say there's a sort of expertise that we all have connected to smell. We've become routine experts in being able to differentiate the moral dimensions of spaces and places, the moral dimensions of relationships and so forth, by virtue of smell. So our noses are part of our sort of experiential expertise, what we might think of as being an olfactory epistemology, the everyday ways in which we make knowledge about the world feature smell. This also plays a role to some degree in some professional practices, so there are expert roles set up around smell, like being a sommelier. You need to have a good nose for different kinds of wine and grapes and so forth. But I think it's interesting to think about how smell plays a role in other forms of expertise where we might not expect it. And in the sewerage works, I hadn't gone in anticipating studying smell in any way, but once you're there, it's very hard to get away from it. It really reeks. And if it hadn't been for me bringing up this question of, like, it smells so bad, I would never have gotten to an interesting finding that I found, that the process engineers who worked with the sewerage every day, not only were their sort of lives set up around showering and having double layers of clothes and so forth, they were also set up around smell as a kind of expertise that they had. And they referred to being able to sense burger van smell when the sewerage pits had gone bad and the bacteria needed more oxygen for the pit to work effectively. Why this was interesting in terms of connecting the personal to the political is that those process engineers' expertise had been transformed into automatic processes over the past sort of 10 to 20 years. The in the sewerage is now done automatically and calibrated electronically. And sometimes they would use their ability to sense bergamot smell to override the automatic system and add more oxygen to the pits, but this had become problematic and some process engineers were losing their jobs because they were overriding the system. And if you now go to these places, you're very unlikely to find people really anywhere around. There has to be someone on site, but the numbers of people has dwindled. So kinds of olfactory expertise grow and decline over time with relationship to different kinds of practices.
And then from the menthol project, this is a very short extract from a couple who I was doing a home tour with, and they're talking about these kinds of shower gels, original source type shower gels, and Helen had talked about being slightly sensitive and finding them very strong smells, whereas James, he quite liked the menthol and mint to use that as part of his shower gel, and he says when he goes to the supermarket, they're often on multi-buy, and he would often like to buy lots of them at once, like 4 at a time. But because Helen's sensitive, he tends to he is conscious of the fact that he can't just do that, and he buys other flavours and aromas as well. And so partly this connects to the political, it's the micropolitics of how people negotiate their relationships and at home. But the other point I wanted to make was that the senses and this kind of elicitation really pulls out the bodily and somatic aspects in people's accounts, so how people narrate and relate these things to how they sense and their bodies as well. So we've got 4 final slides that we're just going to have some methodological reflections on, but feel free to, if you've got questions that you've had, feel free to chip in during this time, and I'll use this time.
So I think some of what we've shown is a range of different methods that we've been using to elicit talk about smell, from the traditional kinds of ethnographic things through to object elicitation, sort of like mapping kinds of talk, asking people to remember and to recount, telling biographical stories, participant observation, that kind of thing. And it can be quite challenging to elicit talk about smell sometimes. It's one of the key problems with these kind of ephemeral phenomena. But by just quickly engaging you in a couple of activities, I think we've shown that it can be done, but it's different for different people. A further challenge with it is how to represent that data, how to deal with publishing industries that are mostly focused around text. And some of what we've got coming up after this kind of speaks to that. But I think it poses this challenge that we should try and use video, photography, sketching, poetry, mapping, all these processes of making and representing to try to deal with the more ephemeral parts of life. But we don't need to let go of text. I think text actually can do a good job around elicitation and representation of smell. But when using text, we may need to do a bit more with the context of where that comes from and to place quotations from interviews in greater context of the interview as a whole, but also of the encounter, the space, the place, the politics that are involved there.
So just quickly, one example that I used in my own research, you could just click onto the link, or is to use different mapping techniques in order to get a detailed understanding about how the atmospheres around the market were changing. We used some hand-drawn maps when we were doing ethnographic observation work. And then working with a team of other researchers, we brought together these maps as a way of analysing our findings. And you can have a look at this in your own time if you're interested, but then we layered the different senses together. And the reason that we did this was to look at how the senses might be, where in this particular area senses might be particularly strong. And then we used these in order to, and then we mapped also people's stories onto particular areas. So you can see here that we've done that with smell and also sound and textures. So this was very much part of our methodological approach, the mapping, but it was also a way of representing as well our findings.
So I think if you're building a project that's going to involve smell, or if you're working on a project where smell might be coming in to some degree, and practically everything we do will involve smell in some degree, it's interesting to think in advance, if you can, about data collection methods and how that could link to data representation methods, because it's that transition that often marks the key change in what we're up to.
And so this is sensory Smithfield, if anyone would like to look.
You should get the slides, I think,
Yep.
so should be able to go to that.
Just another point about methods, if you is that we don't often lots of the types of research that we're doing about everyday life are sensory in their nature. So even if we've not been asking specific questions about smell or about sound, what we might be able to do is to reread existing data using a sensory lens. So it might be interesting, if you've done some of your own research, to have a look back at some of the interviews that you've been doing and to see where smell might come up, and to think about why that's been particularly, why people have mentioned particular sensory experiences. So I've described this as kind of rereading existing material and thinking about the ways in which the sensory might figure, and then asking further in our analysis about why this is particularly why this has come up.
So I think we sort of said like the senses can be fascinating to study in themselves. Just it's interesting to study smell. I never set out really to study smell, but it's been a big part of the menthol project, and it was a big part of my sewerage project. But I think what that shows is that studying smell and taste as part of a broader project, where you might not have conceived of it from the beginning, could actually play an interesting role in what you're up to. It can sometimes lead to quite unexpected findings, and that was the case with my sewerage work. I hadn't expected to be studying olfactory expertise when I went out there, but it became a key part of what I was up to. But whatever methods you use, consider looking for or eliciting talk about smell, using other methods for exploring smell. So explore other threads in your work. It doesn't need to be about smell, it doesn't need to be about taste. Those things can speak to other practices, to other parts of what you're up to, and Camilla reminds us to keep our nostrils open, just like you might keep your eyes peeled when you're in the field. We said that already. Very briefly, one of these issues is that as we're doing that kind of work, like with anything we study, the meanings for researchers can be quite different from the meanings for participants, and smell can be really powerful in that way. What a smell conjures for us as researchers might be quite different to what it conjures for participants. And that variation can be quite important in exploring your questions. But it can be instructive to bring that difference in, to ask participants about what things mean to them, and then to tell them what it means to you. I think that other part we don't often do is sort of like give our sensory dimensions to a project. And I think in the menthol work that's been really powerful. But it can pose a challenge, just like any involvement of ourselves in our work, because smell is political. It involves ethics and morals, and we may be bringing class and racial and gendered and age dimensions to how we smell as researchers. Not literally how we smell, but how we do the work of smelling things. So it's worth keeping your nostrils open for those differences as well, and remembering that smell can be part of ethical practice as a researcher.
So that's we've given an overview of how we've differently used sensory methods and methodologies, so particularly around smells in our work, and hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight both as a participant but also some of the analytical findings that you might be able to draw on and kind of styles of analysis that you could use.